Julian turned 18 on a Tuesday that felt like any other Tuesday in the Wyoming Territory, except for the fact that Uncle Miller was standing in the doorway of the bunkhouse with a folded piece of paper and a look that suggested a debt was being called in. The ranch was a hard place for a boy who preferred the study of masonry and botany over the branding iron, and Miller had never been a man for charity once the legal obligation of kinship expired. 18 is the age of a man, Julian, Miller said, his voice as flat and uncompromising as the horizon of the high plains. And a man on this ranch earns his keep or finds his own grass. I've given you for years since your father passed, which is 3 years more than most would have offered a boy who spends more time looking at rocks than at the herd. I need this bunk for a new hand who can actually rope a steer without looking like he's trying to dance with it. You have until sundown to clear your kit and vacate the property. Julian didn't argue because arguing with Miller was like trying to talk a cliff into becoming a valley. He packed his canvas bag, which was mostly filled with tools inherited from a father who had been better with a chisel than a plow, a heavy hammer, a spirit level, and a set of precision calipers. He looked out toward the northern edge of the property where the great oak stood. It was a tree so ancient and scarred by lightning that it had become a landmark of its own, a gnarled giant with a hollowed core that the local cattlemen used for shade but never for shelter. It was a massive, living ruin of a tree, over 12 feet in diameter at its base, with a cavity carved by fire and rot decades ago that was large enough to fit a small carriage. While the rest of the town saw a dying husk, Julian saw a structural miracle. He walked toward it with his bag, the sun sinking low, feeling the weight of the steel in his pack. He knew the physics of it. A hollow tree wasn't just a hole, it was a natural chimney and a thermal mass, and if handled correctly, it could be a fortress. He didn't look back at the ranch house, even when he heard Hoke, the senior hand, laughing from the porch. Planning on nesting with the owls, boy? Hoke shouted across the yard. Julian didn't answer. He reached the tree just as the first shadows of the mountain stretched across the grass, touching the rough, deeply furrowed bark that felt like cold stone. He stepped inside the hollow, smelling the dry rot and the old earth, and realized that for the first time in 18 years, he was actually home. To anyone else, the idea of living inside a tree was a desperate act of a vagrant, but Julian's father had been a man who understood the relationship between heat and stone, and he had passed that understanding down through stories and practical lessons. Before the fever took him, he had spent years building the foundations for the regional mills, teaching Julian that the most stable structures were those that worked with the land rather than against it. Julian remembered a specific afternoon in the high summer when they had found a similar hollowed oak in a different county. His father had pointed at the interior wall and explained that the deadwood inside a living tree acts as a natural insulator, trapped between the outer bark and the core. Air is the best blanket, Julian, his father had said, tapping the grey wood. If you can keep the moisture out and the air still, you can survive a blizzard in a bird's nest. Now, standing in the heart of the great oak, Julian began the work of clearing. He spent the first 3 days removing the loose, crumbly heartwood that had turned to mulch over the centuries. He wasn't just cleaning, he was surveying. He found that the lightning strike from 40 years prior had cauterized the interior, creating a hard, carbonized shell that was remarkably resistant to rot. The space inside was nearly 6 feet across and 8 feet high, tapering upward into the dark reaches of the trunk. He needed a floor first. He couldn't sleep on the damp earth, so he hiked to the nearby creek bed and began hauling flat river stones, one by one. He wasn't looking for just any stones, he needed shale and granite that could withstand thermal expansion without cracking. He laid them in a circular pattern, using a mixture of local clay and lime he had traded his last spare boots for at the general store. The floor took a week of back-breaking labor. By the end of it, he had a level, dry surface that sat for inches above the outside ground level. This was crucial for drainage, a point Hoke didn't understand when he rode by on the 10th day to check if the tree boy had frozen yet. "Building a tomb, are you?" Hoke asked, leaning on his saddle horn and looking down at the pile of stones. "The first rain is going to turn that hole into a bucket, Julian. You'll be drowning before you freeze." Julian looked up from his masonry, his hands caked in grey mud. "The floor is sloped 2 degrees toward the opening, Hoke. Physics doesn't allow water to flow uphill, even in a storm." Hoke just spat and rode off, but Julian knew the real challenge wasn't water. It was the coming drop in temperature that the old-timers were already whispering about at the trading post. The most dangerous part of Julian's plan was the fire. Putting a flame inside a wooden structure was generally considered a suicide pact by the common man, but the great oak had a unique architectural advantage that Julian intended to exploit. The hollow core extended nearly 20 feet up the center of the trunk, creating a natural vertical shaft. Julian didn't just want a campfire, he wanted a masonry heater. He spent the next 2 weeks scavenging bricks from an abandoned kill 5 miles to the south. Each brick weighed nearly 5 pounds, and he moved them 4 at a time in his canvas bag, his shoulders raw and bleeding from the straps. He began building the hearth against the back wall of the hollow, furthest from the entrance. He didn't build a simple fire pit, he constructed a Rumford-style fireplace, a design his father had praised for its high efficiency and low smoke output. The back of the fireplace was shallow and angled to radiate heat forward into the living space, rather than letting it escape straight up the flue. He lined the interior of the tree's natural shaft with a thick layer of clay and river sand, creating a heat-shielded chimney that wouldn't ignite the surrounding wood. He spent hours calculating the ratio of the fireplace opening to the flue diameter using a piece of charcoal on a flat stone. If the opening was too large, the tree would fill with smoke. If it was too small, the heat wouldn't reach the bed he intended to build. "It has to breathe," he whispered to the empty trunk, his voice echoing in the chamber. He installed a small, adjustable iron grate he had found in the scrap heap behind the blacksmith's shop. This allowed him to control the airflow from the bottom, creating a bellows effect that could turn a few sticks into a roaring forge-level heat source. When he finally finished the masonry, the fireplace looked like a stone heart grafted into the tree's ribs. It was a beautiful, functional piece of engineering. On the first night he lit a test fire, the smoke rose in a thin, elegant needle straight out of a knothole 20 feet above the ground. Inside, the temperature rose from 40 degrees to a stable 65 in less than 20 minutes. The wood of the tree didn't char, it merely became warm to the touch, acting as a giant radiator for the space. He sat on his stone floor, watching the flames, knowing that while the rest of the county was burning through cords of wood in drafty, uninsulated cabins, he was heating a fortress with nothing more than a handful of scavenged twigs and physics. By mid-October, the transformation of the great oak was nearly complete, and Julian had settled into a rhythm of survival that felt more like an experiment. He had fashioned a door from thick pine planks, reinforced with leather hinges he'd cut from an old saddle. The door wasn't just a barrier, it was a calibrated part of the ventilation system. He carved 2 small, circular holes near the bottom and 2 at the top, allowing for a constant exchange of fresh air while keeping the heat trapped in the middle of the room. He had also constructed a raised bed frame from sturdy oak branches, lashing them together with hemp rope and a series of complex knots. This kept him off the stone floor and allowed the warm air from the fireplace to circulate underneath his bedding. The townspeople had started to take notice. The great oak was visible from the main road leading into the valley, and the sight of steady, blue smoke rising from the top of a living tree was unsettling to the local traditionalists who feared what they didn't understand. One afternoon, a group of 3 men, including the local land surveyor and a merchant named Mr. Henderson, stopped their wagon near the fence line. "It's a fire hazard, boy," Henderson shouted, staying in the wagon as if the tree might explode at any moment. "That tree catches, and the whole north pasture goes with it. You're living in a tinderbox, and you're going to take the ranch with you." Julian stepped out of his doorway, looking remarkably clean and well-rested compared to the hard-pressed ranch hands who were already struggling with the autumn chill. "The interior is lined with 2 inches of wet clay and stone, Mr. Henderson," Julian explained, his voice calm and steady despite the accusation. "The ignition temperature of seasoned oak is over 400 degrees. The exterior of my stone flue never exceeds 100. The tree is safer now than it was when lightning was hitting it every decade. I'm managing the heat, not just letting it run wild." The surveyor squinted at the structure, noting the precision of the door frame and the lack of any soot or charring on the outer bark. "You've got a draw on that flue like a steam engine," the surveyor remarked, almost despite himself. "How are you managing the pressure in such a tight space?" Julian smiled slightly. "The Venturi effect. The natural taper of the hollow trunk speeds up the escaping air, creating a vacuum that pulls oxygen into the hearth. No bellows required. The men exchanged looks, a mix of confusion and reluctant respect, but Henderson just shook his head. Physics won't save you when the great freeze hits, Julian. My barometer is lower than I've seen it in 20 years. That tree will be your coffin by January. Julian just nodded and went back inside to check his wood stores. He had 3 cords of seasoned hardwood stacked neatly against the outer roots, and his internal temperature remained a constant, golden warmth that no skeptic could touch. The first real test of Julian's engineering came on the night of November 12. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in 6 hours, a brutal front that brought a horizontal sleet that turned everything in the valley into a sheet of gray glass. On the Miller Ranch, the bunkhouse was a scene of misery. The wind whistled through the gaps in the logs where the chinking had failed, and the single pot-belly stove struggled to keep the room even 10 degrees above freezing. Hoke and the others were huddled in every blanket they owned, cursing the draft and the lack of insulation. Meanwhile, half a mile away, Julian was reading a book by the light of a small tallow candle. Inside the oak, the silence was absolute. The thick bark and the layers of deadwood acted as a sound dampener, turning the howling gale into a distant, melodic hum. Julian monitored his thermal indicators, simple marks he'd made on the stone fireplace to track how far the heat soaked into the masonry over time. Even with the blizzard raging outside, the interior walls of the tree were warm to the touch. He had achieved what his father called thermal equilibrium, where the heat lost through the door was perfectly balanced by the heat radiated from the stones. He had even managed to engineer a small oven into the side of the hearth, where he baked a small loaf of cornmeal bread while the storm battered the valley. The next morning, the world was buried under 2 feet of snow. Julian pushed open his door, which he designed to swing inward for exactly this reason, and stepped out into a crystalline, frozen landscape. He saw a horseman struggling through the drifts toward him. It was Miller himself, looking haggard and red-faced from the cold. He stopped 10 feet away, his horse steaming in the frigid air, the animal's breath turning to ice on its muzzle. "We lost 3 head of cattle in the North Draw last night," Miller said, his breath blooming in white clouds. "And the bunkhouse stove cracked under the strain. We can't keep a fire going, and the men are freezing." He looked at Julian, who was standing in his shirt sleeves in the doorway, the warmth from the tree pouring out behind him like an invisible golden wave. "You're not shivering," Miller noted, his voice sounding small and tired against the vast, frozen silence of the plains. "The tree is at 68 degrees, Uncle," Julian said, stepping back to let the man see the glowing hearth. "I have enough wood for 4 months, and my walls are 5 feet thick. I'm not just surviving, I'm comfortable." Miller looked at the smoke rising steadily from the top of the oak, a defiant signal of survival in a landscape that wanted everything dead. He didn't apologize for the exile, but he didn't mock Julian either. He just turned his horse and rode back toward the shivering ranch house, leaving the boy who had been thrown out to the warmth of a home built from knowledge and a hollow tree. By late December, the moisture management inside the great oak had become Julian's primary engineering obsession. In a space so small, the breath of a single human could quickly turn into condensation that would rot the interior wood or chill the occupant. Julian realized that the living part of the tree, the cambium layer just beneath the bark, was actually assisting him. It was a biological heat sink that absorbed excess humidity. To further refine this, he dug a secondary vent into the root system, tunneling 3 feet down into the frost-free earth. He lined this tunnel with smooth, round stones from the creek, creating a cool tube that pulled air from deep underground where the temperature was a constant 50 degrees. This was a classic application of geothermal principles, though Julian simply thought of it as using the Earth's natural heartbeat. He spent 10 days perfecting the draft, using a small feather to test the airflow at different times of the day. He found that by opening the floor vent and slightly cracking the upper knothole, he could create a passive circulation system that refreshed the air every 15 minutes without losing more than 3 degrees of heat. He also addressed the issue of water storage. He didn't want to leave the tree during a whiteout, so he fashioned a collection system using a long, hollowed-out section of a fallen limb that reached out from a high fissure in the trunk. This acted as a gutter, funneling snowmelt into a large ceramic crock buried in the stone floor. The thermal mass of the floor kept the water from freezing, while the earth's insulation kept it cool and fresh. He calculated his daily intake and found he could store enough water for a 3-week siege. Hoke rode by one afternoon, his breath a thick fog, and saw Julian adjusting the exterior gutter. "You're spending an awful lot of time on pipes for a man who's going to be a frozen statue by New Year's," Hoke called out, his voice tight with the cold. Julian didn't look up from his work. "A statue doesn't need a water system, Hoke. I'm building a life support loop. When the pressure drops and the wind hits 60 miles per hour, you'll be out there chopping ice while I'm drinking from a spring that never freezes." Hoke laughed, but it was a thin, nervous sound. The sky was a bruised, heavy purple, and the birds had long since vanished from the valley. Julian checked his spirit level one last time, ensuring the gutter had exactly a 1-degree pitch. The engineering was sound, the only variable left was the severity of the coming storm. The barometric pressure began to fail on the morning of January 12, 1888. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was a collapse. Julian watched the needle on a small, salvaged barometer he'd traded for in town. It dropped with a speed that suggested a hole had been punched in the sky. By noon, the Great Freeze had arrived, preceded by a wall of white that erased the Miller Ranch and the mountains in a matter of seconds. This was the legendary schoolhouse blizzard, a weather event that would go down in history for its sheer, murderous velocity. The wind didn't just blow, it vibrated the entire great oak, creating a low-frequency hum that Julian felt in his teeth. He quickly retreated inside and secured the heavy pine door, sliding the 3 oak bolts into place. Outside, the temperature plummeted to -40 degrees in less than an hour. The wind reached 70 miles per hour, carrying ice crystals so fine they could penetrate the smallest crack in a standard cabin. But the great oak was not a standard cabin. Its rounded shape allowed the wind to slip around it with minimal resistance, and its massive weight, thousands of tons of living and dead wood, meant it didn't lean or creak like the Miller bunkhouse. Julian sat by his fireplace, which was now performing at its peak. The extreme pressure differential between the calm interior and the raging exterior created a powerful stack effect, drawing air into the hearth with such force that the coals glowed a brilliant, blinding orange. He monitored the temperature carefully. Even as the world outside became a frozen void, the interior of the tree held steady at 64 degrees. He could hear the desperate shriek of the wind, but inside, the air was still and smelled of warm stone and dry wood. He thought of the men at the ranch, who were likely huddled around a failing stove in a room that was leaking heat from every wall. He knew that wood frame construction was a poor match for a thermal event of this magnitude. A cabin was a box of air surrounded by thin planks, his tree was a solid mass of insulation. He felt a strange sense of detachment, a peace born of knowing the math was correct. He ate a small portion of dried beef and watched the flames, realizing that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the vulnerable one. He was the only person in the valley who had truly prepared for the inevitable. By the second night of the blizzard, the situation at the Miller Ranch had turned catastrophic. The bunkhouse chimney had become blocked by a massive ice dam, and the draft had reversed, filling the room with suffocating smoke and forcing the men into the main house. But the main house was no better. The grand, drafty Victorian structure was a heat sieve. Uncle Miller, Henderson, and 4 ranch hands were shivering under piles of furs in the kitchen, the only room they could hope to keep above freezing. "We have to move," Miller said, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely speak. "The barn is sturdier, and the livestock are giving off more heat than this damned stove." Henderson, whose face was a pale shade of blue, shook his head. "The barn is 200 yards away. You go out there in this, and you'll lose your bearings in 10 feet. It's a death sentence." Just then, a loud crack echoed through the house, the sound of a support beam contracting so quickly it had split. It was then that they saw it, a faint, steady orange glow coming from the north pasture. Despite the horizontal snow, the heat from Julian's chimney was so intense it was melting the snowflakes before they could settle on the upper branches, creating a visible pillar of dark air in the white chaos. "That boy's tree," Hoke whispered, staring out the frosted window. "It's still standing. And it's glowing." In a fit of desperation, Miller gathered the men. They tied themselves together with a long hemp rope, a human chain designed to keep them from wandering into the white void. They struggled toward the great oak, moving at a crawl, the wind threatening to rip them off their feet. When they finally reached the tree, they were nearly dead from exhaustion and hypothermia. Miller hammered on the thick pine door with a frozen fist. Julian opened it, and the wave of heat that hit the freezing men was so profound it felt like a physical blow. They stumbled inside, one by one, collapsing onto the warm stone floor. The space that had been designed for one was now packed with 7 men, but the engineering held. The fireplace, fed by Julian's carefully seasoned hardwood, surged to meet the demand of the new, cold bodies. God's teeth, Henderson gasped, feeling the warmth of the stones beneath him. It's like a furnace in here. How is it this hot? Julian didn't answer immediately. He was busy handing out cups of warm water from his crock. It's not God, Mr. Henderson, Julian finally said. It's a 3-to-1 ratio of radiant surface area to cubic volume. You're sitting on 60 square feet of heated granite. The men stayed in the tree for 48 hours, the longest and most intense period of the blizzard. The spatial physics of 7 men in a 6-foot circle was tight, but Julian had designed the ventilation so well that the air remained fresh despite the crowded conditions. He showed them the cool tube intake and the way the fireplace backplate reflected heat in a focus beam. The surveyor, who had once mocked Julian, spent hours examining the masonry with a look of intense concentration. You've built a regenerative heater, the surveyor noted, his voice filled with a new, professional respect. The tree isn't just a shell, it's a heat exchanger. By letting the smoke rise through the center, you're warming the very core of the wood, which then radiates it back to us. It's the most efficient thing I've ever seen. Even Miller was silent, his eyes wandering over the smooth clay walls and the perfectly fitted door. He realized that the boy he had thrown out for looking at rocks had saved his life with that very knowledge. On the 3rd day, the wind finally died down, and the sun broke through a sky of brilliant, cold blue. The men emerged from the great oak into a world that had been transformed into a frozen desert. They looked back at the tree, which stood untouched, a giant of bark and stone. I owe you a ranch, Julian, Miller said, looking at the ground. But I suspect you've got something better here than anything I could give you. Julian shook his head. I don't want the ranch, Uncle. I want the rights to the north pasture and the stone quarry on the ridge. I'm going to build things that don't fall down when the wind blows. Henderson stepped forward, rubbing his hands together. I'll back the permits. If you can make a tree feel like a palace in a -40-degree gale, I want you designing my new warehouse in town. No more drafty wood boxes for me. The social reversal was complete. The tree boy was now the most important engineer in the territory. Julian watched them walk back toward the ranch, their footprints deep in the virgin snow, and then he stepped back into the warmth of the oak to finish his morning coffee. He had proven his point, and in the high plains of Wyoming, competence was the only currency that never devalued. The legacy of Julian's stay in the Great Oak didn't end with the blizzard of 1888, it became the foundation for a new architectural movement in the Wyoming Territory. Over the next decade, Julian moved out of the tree and built a series of thermal mass homes throughout the valley, using the quarry on the North Ridge to provide the granite and shale. These houses became famous for their ability to stay warm with a fraction of the wood required by traditional cabins, and Julian's name became synonymous with the Miller Oak method. He never forgot the tree, however. He purchased the land and established a small laboratory near its roots, continuing his studies into natural insulation and geothermal airflow. The Great Oak itself lived for another 60 years, outlasting most of the men who had sought refuge within it during the Great Storm. It eventually died of old age in the 1940s, but the interior masonry Julian had built remained perfectly intact, a stone heart inside a wooden ghost. When the tree finally fell in a summer storm, the local historical society found that the clay and stone work was so well integrated into the wood that it had to be preserved as a single unit. Today, if you visit the site, you can still see the foundation of the hearth and the cool tube vent Julian dug with his own hands. The story of the boy who survived in a hollow tree is often told as a myth of frontier grit, but those who understand the physics of the world know it was something else entirely. It was a story of a man who looked at a dying ruin and saw the potential for a fortress, who used the laws of thermodynamics to defy an unfair ultimatum, and who proved that in a world of chaos and cold, the most powerful tool a person can possess is an understanding of how things actually work. Julian died a wealthy and respected man, but he always said his best night of sleep was on that first Tuesday in October, wrapped in the bark of an ancient oak, listening to the wind and knowing that his math was right. The tree is gone now, but the principle remains: shelter is not just about walls, it is about the elegant management of energy and the unwavering belief that a well-built dream can withstand any storm.